episode of the DailyFlip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be hopping through a story coming from the New York Times, and it's describing the era of political, I don't want to say craziness, polarization. And we already know this. We already know that our era is not the same as others, that the dividing lines are larger, they feel longer, and they feel stronger than previous eras. But they want to analyze why Trump's the problem. And, of course, we'll get to it. We'll dive into it. This episode will be a little bit shorter, but hey, let's go from here to our daily debate. So, if you were to ask yourself where we are in 30 years, have we repaired? Have we gone past this, like the 60s and 70s? Everybody keeps comparing it to then, and there are plenty of analogies and connections, especially among the political class, that possibly highlight what is the most similar era that we can think of in modern American history. But with that, I want you to just throw it down there, give your opinion. We're going to jump into the actual rest of the story. So, quote, "The first few minutes of President Trump's Oval Office address after the assassination of Charlie Kirk last week followed the conventional presidential playbook. He praised the victim, asked for God to watch over his family, and talked mournfully of a dark moment in America. Then he tossed the playbook aside, angrily blaming the murder on the American left and vowing revenge. That was stark even for some viewers who might normally be sympathetic. When Mr. Trump appeared on Fox News later, a host noted that there were radicals on the right, just as there were radicals on the left, and asked, 'How do we come back together?' The president rejected this premise. The radicals on the right were justified by anger over crime, he said. The radicals on the left are, quote, the radicals on the left are the problem, he added, and, quote, they're vicious and they're horrible, end quote. Notice there wasn't a direct quote around radicals on the right were justified in anger over crime. So, what does this actually mean? Well, one, obviously, we live in a era, no, not even, we live in a presidential regime, and yes, I use the word regime, where only one side can be to blame. That's not to mean, that's not to say that one side is worse than the other. One side is better than the other. I'm not going to do all the lollygag and jumping around milquetoast stuff. You already know where I'm coming from on this one. It's not the president's job to rile up his base in a non-election year. When he gets into that office, he no longer just represents the people that put him there, but he represents the interests of every single American. And even if he doesn't like a faction, even if one of those factions goes about things differently than he would want, even if that faction pushes back against him, he still represents them. He still wants or should have their best interest at heart. He should still fight for them, especially on an international stage. Now, on domestic political stage is a little bit different, and it's harder. In an era where the president is the one point of power, the one who is constantly using executive authority, using the power imbibed in their regulatory agencies to enact their agenda, in a place where all of this power is so centralized, the political beliefs of these presidents become much more important and easier to enact versus an era in time when a Congress would step up in order to fill the breach, a possible counterbalance to the president, an actual working of multiple perspectives fighting it out in the public sphere rather than a central power that has been elected only once, maybe twice, but even then, during the term, they've been elected only once. Now, why are people upset during this time? Why can you feel their palpable disappointment in Donald Trump? At least this author's palpable disappointment, and some commentators, and even possibly myself. Because at moments of great stress, you do not do what you can to double that stress. In moments of great frustration, You should not gin yourself up into more frustration. And this is actually an interesting characteristic that I've noticed about many people. And they are angry at a situation. And normally, what is good when you're interacting with other people and you have a little bit of something on your chest, you talk about it, you try to get it out, and you try to process it verbally with somebody else. And yet, there's also a characteristic among people when doing this that they don't actually get it out, they don't process it, but they continually gin it up. They keep letting their anger build. Rather than being a release, it is like a snowball. Rather than being a release, it's a build-up mechanism. You're constantly reminding yourself of the anger. You're constantly reminding yourself of what this person did wrong to you and why you're frustrated about it. And a president who continually just blames all of a certain characteristic of bad behavior on the radical left, or does this at a time when people are hurt to their core, when they're questioning their assumptions, when they are wondering if our democracy is safe. It is much easier at that moment to turn to somebody and blame them and point the finger. And when you have the snowball effect of anger and frustration and the buildup of pressure, I wonder how much we can handle before we burst. And I would say it is the responsibility of the president to appeal to our better angels. Now, we as a country, put a person into the White House who doesn't do that. And he has done many things that many people greatly, greatly enjoy and will appreciate for years to come. And maybe even their families will appreciate. He's tried to imbibe some of those values that a lot of people put him there for. But this is the other thing that you have to consider when a president is put in office, his temperament. We already knew this. The argument had already been made, and yet this is another great example of why some people were not wise enough, and some people may include myself, were not wise enough to understand why temperament is so important. Some of us maybe have been, the temperament's not the problem, it's these other things. Why does the temperament matter? We're not pushing back against that. He's angry, loud, proud, he's out there. He is doing what he's supposed to do. He is doing things that people are uncomfortable with, and that's actually an appealing part of him. And yet, in these moments, it's so much more clear. It is so much easier to understand why those are things that we cannot simply brush aside and not take seriously. Maybe you want those characteristics, maybe you still think that they're good, but maybe you don't want them in situations like this. Maybe you want a little bit more balance. Maybe you want a little bit more nuance. I hope that this administration, I was listening to something this morning, this administration is hurt. They knew Charlie. They watched him grow. They were possibly there for, Charlie was with the Trump campaign throughout 2016. They became close family friends. They saw what he became. And he was close with J.D. Vance and that side of the administration. He was entwined. And when someone is that deeply entwined and then they are suddenly ripped out, all of the gaps and crevices that they filled and that they permeated into are now empty, and that hurts. It stings. You ask yourself, why? Why, God? Why did we lose a person who was so intimately involved? And the argument would come from a lot of people, and I would have to agree with them. Why did a person who in his personal life cared about the individuals that were surrounding him, that loved his kids, that gave to others, why was he taken so young? And that, on top of the fact that he wasn't just some random person who decided to interact with any of these given people, has left them vulnerable. And it takes a very strong person, a very strong temperament to not overreact in these cases. And we'll see how it continues to pan out. I worry, but I also have hope. If I was to lose hope, I would be no better than other actors and political commentators to be so cynical as to say that there's nothing different here. My opinion can't be wrong. I have a better understanding of the decay and rot of America. And though I'm arrogant enough most of the time to think that, I'm not arrogant enough, and I am not cynical enough, and I don't feel lost enough in order to make that statement. I hope that the administration, everybody on the right, everybody on the left, can all seriously look at themselves and their movements and ask the question, am I a part of the reason that this happened? Don't lay the blame at anybody. Don't torture yourself over it. But ask what you could have done differently. Self-reflection in these moments is just as important as understanding the causes and the external factors in the opposite side's opinion. So, with that said, thank you for joining me for this episode of the DailyFlip podcast. I'm your host. If you want to listen to any of today's or any of the previous episodes, there'll be links in the description to Spotify, Podcast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle at Your Daily Flip, where I post links to these episodes on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and the normal international news segment, 6 and 6, on Tuesday and Thursday. So, with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.